Dakota. This is Tea Chai Tei's second online tea class. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about just some of the basics of black tea, what it is, some of its early history, and some of its original types. I'm not going to be talking about the British traditions around black tea today, since that is a whole class in and of itself. So instead I'm going to be talking about black tea in China, its transplantation to India, and then the differences between them. So to start out with, I do want to just talk about what exactly black tea is, what defines it, what makes it unique. So essentially what black tea is it is a fully oxidized tea. And as we did talk about in our last video, our other tea class, oxidation is the process of the breaking down of polyphenols and catechins in tea, which are flavor molecules and also antioxidants, by the PPO enzyme into other molecules, particularly melanin, which is a reddish brown dark pigment. So the more oxidized a tea is, the more melanin is in it and the darker the leaf gets. Hence the name black tea for fully oxidized teas. So when you oxidize a tea, you get fewer tannins, fewer polyphenols, and this causes the tea to have a darker color, but also a more rounded, fruity or malty flavor. The first ever black tea, which was Zhengshan Xiaozhong or Laosang Suchong, was invented in Fujian province in China during the early Ming dynasty. Legend has it was probably invented by accident. A tea farmer was forced to dry his latest batch of tea leaves very quickly and discovered that drying them over a smoky fire, pine wood smoke, allowed him to streamline the process. And at the same time, the prolonged exposure to humidity started the oxidation process, which up until then was not traditional for teas. And thus black tea was born, and the practice of oxidizing tea gradually spread to other parts of China, and other famous types of tea were created. Tea was first exported into Europe from China by the Dutch in the early 1600s. No more than 50 years after that, tea started to become extremely popular in Britain, where demand skyrocketed within less than 100 years. In order to supply this demand, Britain was forced to deal with China, which at the time was the only producer of any kind of tea. So China basically had a monopoly on the tea trade, and they were able to place massive taxes on it. And in addition to this, Britain was not really able to pay for tea in the way that the Chinese wanted, because China was self-sufficient. They did not want to accept traded goods for their tea. They instead wanted cash. And the British Empire at that time was not rich in cash, it was rich in goods because it had a lot of colonies. So in order to supply the ever-growing demand for tea in Britain, the East India Trading Company introduced opium to China in order to get China addicted to opium, literally, so that they could then trade opium for tea. This eventually led to the First and Second Opium Wars, with the Chinese government not being happy about all the drugs flooding into their country, and the British not being happy about all of the harbor closures and increased taxes that the Chinese were putting on everything. Both of these wars ended in favor of the British, with the Chinese being forced to cede several major ports, including Hong Kong, and lower their taxes on tea. But around this time, Britain was also looking for other ways that they could supply their demand for tea, and this is what eventually led to the introduction of tea to India. Now, Britain already knew that growing tea in India would work because wild tea trees had been discovered in the jungles of Assam in the early 1800s by Major Robert Bruce, who's a Scottish explorer. But all of the previous attempts to grow tea in India had failed due to a lack of expertise, basically. In the mid-1800s, Britain sent a spy into China to try and discover some of the secrets of the tea trade. His name was Robert Fortune, who's a botanist, and by posing as a tea trader, he was able to learn enough about tea to figure out how black tea was made. So, Robert Fortune, in partnership with one of Robert Bruce's brothers, was able to create the first ever successful tea plantation in India in the Darjeeling region. And from there, Britain was able to industrialize the production of tea. They created more and more gardens in both Darjeeling and Assam, as well as some other regions of India. And the Indian tea trade was born, basically. So that's why India produces almost exclusively black teas, Even up to today, over 95% of all Indian tea production is black tea because that is the way it was first introduced. So that's still where all of their expertise is.
What's the other 5%?
Experimental greens and oolongs.
Oh.
Now I want to talk about, just briefly, some of the differences in both production and in the market style between India and China in terms of their black teas. So in China does not produce a whole lot of black tea. China produces more green tea than anything else by far. Black tea is fourth largest in terms of types of tea that China produces, although it is second in export because it's very popular around the world. By comparison, India produces almost exclusively black tea. Like I had mentioned, over 95% of its production is black tea. And it's very industrialized, so it produces very high volumes of tea as compared to China. China is more of a specialty tea market than an industrial tea market. In terms of processing differences, in China, black teas are processed using a more gradual, subtle approach for oxidation. So black tea leaves are going to be laid out for around 8 to 12 hours in approximately 72 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, ideally in high humidity, and covered with a damp cloth. This is after you would roll the leaves with your hands to break up the cell wall to start the oxidation process, and then the high humidity and high heat accelerates that process. So Chinese black teas are oxidized very gradually as compared to other black tea producing areas. And this gradual oxidation leads to much less astringency in general, and also leads to a very distinctive earthy aroma and a burnt sugar or burnt honey-like aftertaste. It's pretty characteristic of most Chinese black teas. India, by comparison, achieves pretty much all of their tea processing, including oxidation, through industrial or mechanized means. So Indian black teas are oxidized using a humidifier in between 68 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit, and they are not oxidized for as long, and they are oxidized more intensely. So Indian black teas are oxidized between 30 minutes and 4 hours, depending on the quality of tea you're trying to achieve. In general, the more high-end an Indian black tea is, the less it is oxidized. So like, for example, Darjeelings are among the least oxidized of all black teas. They're technically considered oolongs by several people because most Darjeelings, especially the early harvests, the early flushes of Darjeeling, are only oxidized up to 30 or 40%, as opposed to most black teas are around 70 or 80% oxidized. Next I'm going to talk a little bit. Next I'm going to do a demonstration of comparative tea tasting, as would be done in primarily Indian tea auctions to determine the quality of tea. I'm going to do a comparison between the Chinese black tea. I'm using the Zhenqiu, which is a high-grade Dianhong tea from Yunnan, and then I'm doing an Indian tea. I'm doing the Darjeeling, which Tea Chai Taste Darjeeling is a second flush Darjeeling. So yeah. Okay, so to do a comparative tasting, the very first thing you would do is put some leaves into your cup. In this case, I'm using Gaiwan's because I don't have actually a traditional cup that you would use for this. Typically it would be a mug with a lid. And the standardized measurements that you'd be using for this, I'm putting in Darjeeling right now. For black teas in general, you use approximately 3 grams of tea per 4 ounces of water. So the idea is to really concentrate the flavors so that you can taste everything. Fill your cups with hot water. And for black teas, you want to use water that's around 200 degrees. And then the standardized infusion time for black teas, again, is 3 minutes. And again, the idea is to let all the flavors become concentrated, so that if there are any imperfections in the tea, they'll become amplified and you can then taste them more easily. So after 3 minutes, you pour your tea into your tasting cups. traditionally, some white teacups or bowls would be used for this purpose. I am using wine glasses. And so the purpose of using white cups is the same purpose that I'm using clear cups, which is that you can very clearly see the differences in the colors of the tea. Also a very important part of the tasting process. And in terms of brewing, that's it. You're done. You then just taste the teas one after the other, compare them in terms of flavor. Very important note when tasting anything, not just tea. This is important for tea tasting, wine tasting, coffee tasting, all of it. There's a phenomenon called retroolfaction that's very important in detecting certain flavors. So what's very important to do to activate retroolfaction is right after you swallow the tea, you want to breathe out through your nose to allow some of those compounds to come back up and really make sure everything comes out.